Well, the government has so far spent £200 billion tackling the pandemic, and today the Chancellor has promised another £3 billion for the NHS. And in deciding which restrictions will be in place throughout December, the government will be balancing the health of the economy with the health of the nation. Well, joining us now is the man who's got those very difficult decisions to make, the Chancellor Rishi Sunak. Thank you very much for being on the programme this morning, Mr. Sunak. I just want to start off with a question that so many of our viewers will want to know the answer to this morning. Will families be able to meet up at Christmas?
Well, the Prime Minister will be setting out more details tomorrow, Sophie, about the next steps in our fight against coronavirus. I think the good news is we will be exiting national restrictions on the 2nd of December, as the Prime Minister said at the beginning of the month-long restrictions. We'll be going back into a tiered system, which is a far better way to tackle this on a localised approach. And with regard to Christmas, I think frustrating as it is for all of us, Christmas is not going to be normal this year. But that said, the Prime Minister and everyone else were looking at ways to see how families can spend some time with each other over Christmas period. Obviously, that's something that we would like to do, and it's been a difficult year for all of us. But it's, as I said, it's not going to be a normal Christmas this year.
Public Health England said this week that for every day that restrictions are relaxed over Christmas, we could need 5 days of tighter restrictions as a result. We just heard from Professor Callum Semple earlier on the programme, who said he thought that was about right. So if we ease restrictions for Christmas, we're going to be paying for it in January, aren't we?
Well, I think as the Deputy Chief Medical Officer spoke about this just the other day, I think it's difficult to be so precise and granular about the impact of any individual measure that we might take. But that's why I said it's not going to be a normal Christmas this year. I think the good news is we're going to be exiting national restrictions, which is something that people, I think at the beginning of this, were doubtful of, and we said that was very much what we wanted to deliver. We are going to deliver that. Prime Minister will be setting out more details tomorrow about going back to a more localised approach, seeing what we can do to allow families to see each other at Christmas time. But it is not going to be normal.
If it's not going to be normal, what changes are you going to be making this Christmas?
Well, I wait with everyone else. We'll see what the Prime Minister sets out this week about what we're going to be able to do, and we'll go from there. But I think fundamentally, I think Christmas is ultimately a time for us to be together with our own families. So that will always be able to be the case, and depending on how many other people we're able to see is what we'll need to see what we can do. But we've put a lot of work in over the past month. It's been enormous sacrifice on everyone's part, and we want to make sure that we continue suppressing the virus. The good news is that we've made improvements, whether it's in mass testing or early promising news on vaccines, that should give us all hope that there are other ways to suppress the spread of the virus as we go through winter, and so we can get to the target that we all want, which is more of our lives and our economy back to normal.
Now, you've mentioned already, of course, that we're going to be leaving the lockdown in England on the 2nd of December and going into this new strengthened tier system. So in what way is the tier system going to be strengthened?
Well, the Prime Minister will set out more details of that tomorrow. What we want to do is constantly adapt and evolve as we gain more information about the virus. And every week, every day that we go through this, we get more data, we can see what's working, what's the most effective way to tackle the spread of this whilst minimising the restrictions on people's freedom. And that's what we do. So on the basis of the advice we get from our medical and scientific advisors, looking at everything in the round, see how we can fine-tune things, as I said, to make sure that what we're doing is as effective as it can be.
So I'm very keen, as well as many businesses will be keen to know the rules about what will happen for shops, pubs, restaurants, businesses for whom Christmas period is absolutely critical. Many of them already on the brink. 750,000 people already lost their jobs since the start of this crisis. Don't these businesses need to be given a fighting chance of survival by being allowed to trade in December?
Well, look, you're absolutely right to highlight all the things that you just did. It's a tragedy that 750,000 people have already lost their jobs. That's millions of families and people who are impacted by that, and it's a difficult time for everyone. And you're right about the stress that businesses are under, particularly in the sectors that you mentioned. That's why we've provided the enormous amount of support to protect people's jobs, protect their livelihoods and to try and support business through what is a very difficult period. And you mentioned hospitality. That's one area where we've tried to do a lot, whether it's cutting VAT, providing cash grants, special loans. All of these things are trying to help that industry get through a difficult period. And you're absolutely right. Those are the kind of things that we need to balance. Yes, we're tackling a health crisis, but it has lots of impacts on other aspects of our lives. And we need to take all of those things in the round when we make these decisions.
I just want to talk to you about a letter that's just been published by the COVID recovery group of Conservative MPs, 70 MPs in that group, a letter to the Prime Minister. And they want the government to publish the full cost-benefit analysis of the tier system of lockdown. They say we cannot support this approach unless the government demonstrates the restrictions proposed after the 2nd of December will save more lives than they cost. Today, the lockdown cure prescribed runs the very real risk of being worse than the disease. What's your reaction to that, and will you publish the full cost-benefit analysis?
Well, I think I've spoken about the economic side of this many times, and what I'd say is, I think it's, as I just said previously when we were having the conversation, it's right that we look at all of the impacts of fighting coronavirus in the round. And they're not just economic. Obviously, there are job losses and business.
Will you publish the cost-benefit analysis?
Well, I say on the economic side, as I've said, it's very hard to be precise in estimating the particular impact of a one-week restriction.
You must have some estimates done, though, surely.
But what you will see next week when we have the spending review, alongside that will be a set of forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility, the independent forecasting and fiscal watchdog we have in this country, which will show the enormous strain and stress that our economy is experiencing, the job losses that you mentioned, the forecast for what will happen. And it's right that we think about those in the round as we consider the best way to fight the virus.
OK. Now, I just want to read you a letter or a message that I was sent from a viewer called Chris, who asked me to ask something of you. I've received many of these before the interview with you. And Chris says, please ask Rishi Sunak about the people excluded from government support. Please don't accept his usual response of, well, we've done lots to help those people over there, and ignore the question. It's the equivalent of your house burning down and the fire brigade claiming they've done a good job because they sprayed water on next door. Meanwhile, you're left with no home. What can you say to Chris?
Well, first, I'm sorry to hear that Chris is going through a difficult time, like many others, through this crisis. I have every sympathy for him. Now, it's difficult for me, without knowing his particular circumstances, what we might have done that would be of benefit to him, which is why I have to talk slightly in generalities. But I think if he's self-employed, I'd probably say I'm confident in knowing that the support we've provided...
Director, if that helps.
Is more comprehensive and generous than pretty much any other country. Between 3.5 and 4 million people have been eligible for that support, which has gone out in various tranches and will continue through the winter. And beyond the direct support for the self-employed, we've made lots of other changes here and there that may help him, whether it's offering discounted loans, whether it's strengthening our welfare system, help with people's mortgages or council tax payments. So I'm confident that we've done an enormous amount. That said, I know, of course, there will be people who will feel they haven't got the help they want in exactly the way they want.
Okay.
But as I said, we are always trying to do what we can to provide support to people through the winter and throughout this crisis.
OK, well, let's talk about the all-important spending review, shall we? You're announcing an extra £3 billion for the NHS to help people who've had their treatment delayed by the pandemic. Is this an admission that non-COVID patients have been let down?
Well, I think this is about one of the impacts that we were just talking about, Sophie, when you asked about the other impacts of restrictions, and this is what happened earlier on. We know we've got a backlog of people who have missed, whether it's mental health treatments or elective surgery or scans. So what we're doing is investing £3 billion into the NHS next year to help them make a start on tackling that. This will provide enough funding to do 1 million treatments, scans, surgeries to make a start on tackling that backlog. Lots of that is also for mental health treatments that have been missed. And it's right that we do that. But as you rightly point out, what this illustrates is one of the other costs of what we've had to do to tackle coronavirus alongside the economic costs.
You'll also, of course, be laying out that economic cost and talking about the state of the public finances, which we both know is going to be a pretty sobering read. 750,000 people have lost their jobs during the pandemic. Our national debt is more than £2 trillion. That's bigger than the entire UK economy of GDP. Borrowing is at its highest level since records began. How have we ended up with what seems to be the worst of all worlds, a wrecked economy and the highest COVID death toll in Europe?
Well, I think, look, when it comes to the economic impact, in common with many other countries, we're seeing a significant impact this year. Now, one thing that is particular about our economy is social activities. For example, the ones we've been talking about, going out, having a meal, seeing people, they comprise a slightly larger share of our economy than they do for other countries. Obviously, that's the part of our economy that's had the most impact of all of this, so it's unsurprising that we're seeing the results that we are. The initial lockdown we had in duration was longer than other countries. That will, of course, have had an impact as well. And I think slightly more technically, but still, I think a point worthy of note is the way in which we calculate impacts on GDP is slightly different to other countries. And I don't need to probably go into it in detail here, but there's a way we calculate activity in the public sector is different, which means that some of our numbers may actually look a lot worse when you compare them to other countries. But on a genuinely comparable basis, they wouldn't quite be as stark a difference. But I said, look, no one is pretending there has not been a significant impact on our economy. There has. That's why we have stepped in to provide the support to protect millions of jobs and people's livelihoods and businesses best we can through this period.
So what are you going to do from Wednesday onwards to try and rebalance and deal with the finances? Are you looking at tax cuts? Are you looking at, tax rises, should I say, spending cuts, or both?
Well, next week is about spending review, which is more focused on providing spending budgets for departments next year. And because of the uncertainty that we're experiencing at the moment, we took the decision to make that just a one-year spending review. So most departments will see their budgets rolled over. And that's because our primary focus at the moment is rightly on responding to coronavirus. So providing the funds we need for the health response, whether that's test and trace, mass testing, vaccines, the NHS, or indeed protecting people's jobs, businesses and livelihoods, as we've talked about. That's the priority for next week. But you will also see us getting on with delivering on what we were elected to do, which is invest in public services and invest in infrastructure around the country to level up, spread opportunity and help drive our economic recovery.
But one of your biggest challenges as Chancellor, if not the biggest challenge, is going to have to chart a way forward for the economy after this huge economic shock that has happened. And there's been lots of reports about a proposed planned public sector pay freeze. Frances O'Grady was on just before you talking about why she thinks that would be a really bad idea. And of course, many of these workers that she was talking about, people like teachers, refuse collectors, prison officers, these are people who've been working on the front line during lockdown. You and the Prime Minister have both said you don't want to return to austerity. But for many of these people, the hallmark of austerity was seeing a pay freeze. So if it looks like austerity, if it sounds like austerity, if it feels like austerity, then it is austerity, isn't it?
Well, I don't think that's fair characterisation at all. And first of all, I've worked with Frances closely during this crisis on various things, so I very much, listen to what she has to say and respectively disagree in some areas. I think you will not see austerity next week. What you will see is an increase in the government spending on day-to-day public services, quite a significant one coming on the increase that we had last year. So I think there's absolutely no way in which anyone could say that's austerity. We'll be spending more money on public services than we were. And then, with regard, I can't comment on future pay policy in advance of the spending review, but what I would say is when we launched the spending review, I did say to departments that when we think about public settlements, I think it would be entirely reasonable to think about those in the context of the wider economic climate. I think that's a reasonable thing to do. And then also, secondly, I think it would be fair, and Frances, I think, used the word fairness as well. I think it would be fair to also think about what's happening with wages, with jobs, with hours across the economy when we think about what the right thing to do in the public sector is.
So listening to the end part of that answer, are you considering a pay freeze for public sector workers?
As I said, Sophie, I can't comment in advance of pay policy being set at the spending review, and I just point you
but
those
you're
are
not
the
ruling
things
it
that
out.
we talk. when we launch. I mean, you can ask me any question and say, are you ruling out, ruling it in? I mean, those are the points I made. When we launched the spending.
You are also talking about fairness, and you said that you're looking at wages and you're looking at what would be the right thing to do there.
As I say, yes, when we launched the spending review, we said when we think about public sector pay, that should be done in the context of the overall economic climate. I think that's an entirely reasonable thing to do. And also, as Francis also talked about fairness, as we discussed, we need to see what's going on with wages, with jobs, with employment, with hours across the economy when we calibrate and figure out what the best thing to do for public sector is as well.
Your manifesto at the last election said we will not raise the rate of income tax, VAT or national insurance. So are you going to stick to that promise? And if you are, does that mean that you're going to have to at some point look at other taxes, such as potentially capital gains tax?
Sophie, whenever I'm on here and you try and ask me these things, I'm sorry, I have to give you the same answer. I can't comment on future fiscal policy for all the obvious reasons. And I think it's probably right for people to remember the next week is a spending review. It's not a budget. And in the spending review, what we're doing is setting out the department's budgets for next year. And as I said, what you'll see is more investment in day-to-day public services, getting on with our manifesto, investing in infrastructure to spread opportunity around the country, drive our recovery, but primarily the focus will be on fighting coronavirus. So funding for our health response and also protection for people's jobs and their livelihoods through this crisis. That's our focus, and it should be our focus at this time.
I've got a feeling that I might get a similar answer to this next question, but I am going to ask it anyway because I think it's so important to so many people across the country. The government increased universal credit by £20 a week because of the coronavirus pandemic, but that's due to end next April. According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, that could push 700,000 people, including 300,000 children, into poverty. Are you looking at extending that?
Well, what I'd say is you're absolutely right, and that was one of the steps that we took at the beginning of this crisis. It was one of a number of things we did to provide support to people, through the acute phase of this crisis. It runs all the way to April, as you said, and so there's no need to make a decision on it now. Many of the things that we've put in place, whether it's furlough or the others, they run through the winter into the spring, and we keep everything under review, and we'll make the decisions that are right for the economy. I think one thing we know and have learned, this virus is adapting, evolving. Our ability to combat it is adapting and evolving. So there's an enormous amount of uncertainty at the moment, and it wouldn't be right to make long-term decisions right now. But of course, as we get through, and we'll have future events like budgets where we can take stock of and see what's the right way both to support the economy, but importantly to support people in their jobs and employment, and support businesses as we try and hopefully emerge from this and get back to growing again.
There's also been a lot of speculation about what's going to happen with foreign aid. I'm just going to read what your manifesto said. We will proudly maintain our commitment to spend 0.7% of gross national income on development. Are you going to stick to that promise?
Again, we've got a spending review on Wednesday where we'll talk about all the budgets.
Well, I'm asking about your manifesto in an election that was just last year.
Yeah, and you're right to have read that out, and I am proud of our commitment, and I think we've seen that in the last few months. We've played, I think, a leading role in helping to combat this pandemic, not just at home, but also abroad as well, whether it's helping to provide vaccines to other countries, using the brilliance of our researchers here to get treatments to places around the world. So there are lots of different ways that we've demonstrated leadership and made a difference to some of the world's poorest countries at what has been a very difficult time, and that will never, that will never stop whilst we're in government.
Okay. Just finally, if the minister breaks the ministerial code, should they remain a minister?
Well, you'll know that the Prime Minister is the ultimate arbiter of the ministerial code. That's how it's set out, and the Prime Minister is the one that will make that judgment on a case-by-case basis. And I think, obviously, you'll be asking, I'm sure, about the Home Secretary. The Prime Minister's reviewed the findings of the independent advisor, has come to the conclusion that he has, and the Home Secretary has rightly offered a full and unreserved apology, and the Prime Minister said that as far as he's concerned, means that the matter should be put a line under, and we should move on. And I'm glad to hear that the culture has improved in the Home Office, and we're getting back to doing what people want us to do, which is focus on keeping their streets safe, fighting crime.
Good to say that things have improved at the Home Office after people found out what was happening there before. You say the Prime Minister is the ultimate arbiter of the Ministerial Code, but for many people, that's kind of the issue that they're worried about, because you can see why some might question whether he's approached this from a neutral perspective. In March, when the inquiry was launched, so well before it had found anything out, he said that Priti Patel was doing an outstanding job and I have every confidence in her. I am sticking by her. That's before the conclusions. According to Whitehall sources, when the report was published, he tried to water it down and then he asked Conservative MPs to form a square around the Pritster. Is there one rule for Boris Johnson, or is there one rule for friends of Boris Johnson and another rule for everyone else?
Well, look, there was a review conducted by an independent advisor, and the findings of that review have been published. And as the system works, it's right that the Prime Minister, as the person who is in charge and runs a government, is able to receive that report, go through the findings and make a decision that he thinks is right, weighing up all the considerations. That's what he's done. The Home Secretary has offered a full and unreserved apology for what's happened. And I think at that point, we can move on and focus on the things that people want us to do, which is keeping their streets safe. And that's what the Home Secretary is doing. That's what the government is doing.
I can understand why the government might want to move on from this, but it does feel that there may be still questions to answer on it. The report from the government's now former advisor on standards said, my advice is that the Home Secretary has not consistently met the high standards required by the Ministerial Code. Her approach on occasions has amounted to behaviour that can be described as bullying. So on what basis has the Prime Minister reached a different conclusion?
Well, I think the Prime Minister's reviewed everything and has come to the conclusion that he has, and he doesn't believe that the Home Secretary is and respectfully, it is a different conclusion. He doesn't believe the Home Secretary is a bully, but the Home Secretary has offered a full and unreserved apology for what's happened. And I think at that point, the Prime Minister's made his decision, and we should get back to focusing on what people want.
OK. Rishi Sunak, we are out of time, but thank you very much for coming on the programme ahead of such a busy week for you. Thank you.